we're in the midst of the worst cost of living crisis for at least 70 years. We at the New Economics Foundation think about 40% of us won't be able to afford the basics at the next election. Everyone is feeling the squeeze in terms of bills and in terms of kind of being able to afford what we used to be able to afford in life, right? That's clearly been quite bad. And while that is like part of that is global factors, we know that the UK has had it much worse than other nations. We know that, for example, we have the worst pandemic recovery in the G7. We know that we're going to have the highest inflation rates because actually our energy bills are much higher, and I'll come on to why, but basically natural gas and home insulation. And that, of course, comes after a decade where we really haven't seen much growth at all. And on the horizon are these huge challenges, particularly around kind of leveling up, as well as the climate crisis and the need to get to a green New Deal. So a country that certainly isn't in a good shape right now, and a country like it's worth thinking about how it's changed and the long-term challenges of what we need to address them. What we actually need inside the United Kingdom, and indeed what we've seen across kind of high-income nations, is the country is divided between people and places, and kind of dangerously so. And on the other side as well, kind of a need to fix that. So kind of in the post-war, it's going like really far back. What used to happen was people would go to work, they'd get some qualifications, and then just get a good job at like the manufacturing plant or the factory down the road, and that was enough to sustain them through their lives. What we then saw at the beginning of the 1980s, technological change and trade really destroys those mid-pay manufacturing jobs and plants. What it leads to is a concentration of good work, of high-wage jobs in major cities. And inside the United Kingdom in particular, that major city ended up being in London. So what we ended up seeing was this huge divide between places begin to open up in the 1980s. And indeed, the areas that we now think of as being kind of the red wall are the areas the United States would call being the Rust Belt, right? The Rust Belt of those former industrial areas. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that those are the areas that end up supporting, both Brexit and Donald Trump. Certainly, the relative kind of fall in economic prosperity has not really helped them. And on the other side, this divide between jobs. You used to have these mid-pay manufacturing jobs, but now what you have is kind of some high-paid graduate jobs on the other side and a lot of low-paid service jobs on the rest of it, and just not very much in between. So the old compact of I would leave school, go get a good job, be able to provide my family, that compact has now kind of fallen to the wayside. And so when we were in government last time, the way we kind of helped to address that was through tax credits and through things like the minimum wage. Those were the things that we ended up doing. And of course, what we've seen since 2010 is those have all been cut away, basically. There's not really been that for that time. And then we saw, of course, in 2010, austerity come and actually cuts in investment that we're now starting to really see the price of, and the price start to build in over time. The cuts George Osborne was making in the early 2010s to like public health preventative measures, for example, not something you see the effect of straight away, but is something you start to see hitting the NHS today. The same thing is true for primary care. We see that across local authority budgets, the Ministry of Justice being unable to get court cases. All of those effects have started to really build up and push down over time. And even before kind of the pandemic, we were already going through this period of stagnation. We're now looking at, because the last decade we haven't seen any growth in wages, and for the next decade we won't either. It looks like it'll be about 20 years before wages will hit back where they were in 2008, the peak we had before the financial crisis. We're not looking at a lost decade, which was shocking at the time. We're now looking at a lost 20 years. And of course, on the other side of it, being hit by both kind of the pandemic, as well as the worldwide energy crisis, as well as the need to get to net zero, I mean, actually, this budget really needed to do a lot, right? This budget needed to ensure that we could get families through the immediate problems that we face, invest in our future prosperity, and deal with the long-term crisis that's coming, the climate crisis. And actually, what we saw was a budget that didn't really do any of that at all, right? This was a budget that did not have any real extra help for families. Freezing the energy bill certainly was something we had obviously called for the Labour Party for a long time. That's great, but nothing to get our energy bills down in the longer term. And actually, that's a real problem for us. About 80% of our heating comes through natural gas. Our homes are like the worst insulated in Western Europe. And part of the reason for that is because in the early 2010s, David Cameron said, let's cut the green crap. So cut home indexation grants by over 90%. And there was no plan to kind of deal with that. No plan to say, okay, we need to actually kind of ensure that energy bills will be lower down in the future, right? The reason inflation's fallen so fast is that we got kind of, in one sense, lucky that worldwide gas prices have fallen so far. But there's nothing really to do with this government. And the same thing is true of the kind of technical recession that we ended up avoiding it. That was a luck on the side of the government and not anything else that happened. Think about our other short-term challenges as well. We've heard a lot in this budget about inactivity, and actually what's the key reason for that? It's the NHS. It's the fact that actually we haven't got enough funding in our health service to provide for people. And what do we see? No new extra money. And actually, we at the New Economics Foundation think there's an £8 billion a year cut hidden in these figures at the end of the forecast period in 2027. So nothing really on that side. Nothing as well in terms of investment in our industries or to get more investment into this country. No major infrastructure that I could see being announced. No investment in the kind of renewables that we'll need. The £1 billion a year that we saw on renewable technologies, carbon capture and storage, is, to put that number in context, about the same amount that we spent on Eat Out to help out, that the now Prime Minister spent on subsidizing the spread of the virus. That was the extent of kind of infrastructure spending that we saw within this budget. And no real way or real plan to get forward. And to get to net zero in particular, we know the next decade is incredibly important. We know we have to make the huge investments now, pay up to decarbonize our energy, our transportation systems, and in order to get us, and as well as our buildings, and in order to get us down to net zero, right? But really nothing on that side, nothing to do there. Very little again on leveling up. We saw some pennies in terms of little grants here and there, but nothing really substantial that's going to move the dial. And actually the announcements that we did see, of course, well, not of course, but the announcements that we saw looked a lot better on paper than they do in practice. In particular, I draw everyone's attention to childcare. I saw the kind of news alert come in the day before about childcare, and it was saying, okay, they were going to do a big offer on childcare, which is incredibly welcome if it had happened right properly, because we know we face, I think, the third highest childcare cost in the OECD. We know that families are spending thousands of pounds on childcare, and also it ends up being, because families can't afford it, it limits in particular the career and progression of women, and women being able to kind of move forward in the labour market because they can't afford to put a child into nursery. Their career takes a hit and they end up doing lower paid jobs for the rest of their careers. And this is like the fulfillment of the ambitions of half our population is being locked away because we don't have decent childcare. But we had this announcement on childcare, and then I look at my phone and I was like, 4 billion, and I was like, it's nowhere near enough. 4 billion is nowhere near enough. And you do the numbers and you realize that basically, yes, this figure that they've pulled out is just nowhere near enough to provide what we think is needed, basically. So the government said that it increased the subsidy by about a third. That takes it to every single, I think, 2-year-old to about £6.40 an hour. At the moment in the maintained sector, they charge £8.40 an hour, and some nurseries in London need £10 an hour to provide that care. So the amount of money coming forward just is nowhere near enough to cover that. We also have 30 hours a week being covered by this childcare, which of course stops and precludes full-time work, which is very difficult, again, for someone who wants to progress in their career, and only for 38 weeks a year. Most places who offer annual leave don't offer you leave for 14 weeks a year. They offer you leave for 5.5 weeks a year. So this was an announcement that didn't really have much behind it. The stuff on work and inactivity, I didn't really see a lot about this MOT for older workers, about what they were going to do, but only £5 million behind it. So a really kind of an empty budget. And then thinking about the politics of this budget, the economic side didn't deal with the long-term challenges that we face, either leveling up or net zero. It didn't deal with the short-term challenges in terms of the cost of living crisis. But in terms of the politics as well, we can see, if you like, what the strategy I think will be for the Conservatives the next election. They're trying to replay the 2015 playbook. And the 2015 playbook was basically, the economy was growing in 2015, wages were growing in 2015, and they said, look, our plan has worked, and therefore you should vote for us again. I think there are huge problems with that idea when over a decade on, we're starting to see the failures across our society, right? Back in 2015, we did not have the NHS crisis that we are now experiencing. We didn't have the same degradation that we've now experienced. There's a growing realization that something has gone terribly wrong with where we are. And that's clearly kind of what we as a Labour Party, the argument we have to make. The thing that will be difficult and tricky for us is always hard to sell the counterfactual. In 2015, the big problem we faced was we were saying, look, austerity has cost us so much in terms of growth and incomes and living standards, but trying to sell someone a version of the world that never existed is quite difficult to do. And actually, it's kind of what the Conservatives are hoping for again. But that's clearly where the strategy is. And I also think actually they genuinely believe that actually this low state thing is going to work. For this kind of small state, low taxes will lead to prosperity. And actually, what we've seen is the small state, or I should say not low taxes, but low taxes of the rich, like we've seen that for a decade. And what we've seen for a decade is our prosperity fundamentally undermined, us not doing well as a population here inside the United Kingdom. So that's where we are. That's what the strategy looks like is going to be going to the next election. Also looking forward slightly, I'm expecting therefore they're going to make a tax cut either in this autumn or next spring in order to kind of have some kind of feel-good factor going into the next election. It looks to me now like, given the way that the economy is going to go, so we think incomes will fall this year as well as still be falling a bit next year. It looks like they're prepping for a budget in autumn of 2024. The childcare offer doesn't come in full until September 24. So I'm guessing that they're hoping that young parents will receive the childcare offer, be really grateful, and then kind of vote for them in what I think would probably be an October 24 election. Although, of course, we do have to be ready and prepared. That's where we're on the strategy. On the tactics of this budget, I don't think, we've seen some terrible budgets lately, so it's not fair of me to say this is the worst budget that we've seen, because clearly that was Truss's budget last year, which, brought down a government and saw everyone have their mortgage payments increased by thousands of pounds a year overnight and almost precipitated a financial crisis. But the tax of this budget, I just don't understand what they were doing. We were sat in the office beforehand having the discussion, what would be the big hat that was coming out? And I was like, well, we were like, maybe it's going to be pay, maybe it's going to be NHS funding, maybe an increase in the tax allowances, and nothing. There was no rabbit out of the hat, which meant all the pre-announcements already done. What was everyone focusing on the day? What we didn't know about before. What we didn't know about before was the fact there was going to be this huge £1 billion pension tax change. We knew there was going to be something, but it wasn't going to be as big as it was. And that's where the focus ended up being for that particular budget. And it was, from their perspective, I think it's fair to say, a wasted opportunity. But the problem is, from the British people's perspective, it is actually that we are paying for. We've been paying for the past decade of Conservative government, and now in this cost of living crisis, we're paying for it again. And it's another reason, if there's not, we need another one, why we have to win and go win the next election. I suppose thinking about that, and then to finish on this really, how can we win the next election? Look, I'm an economist, has been covered, I've done this for a while. I would love it if the way that people voted was 5-point plans or the papers that I write. But to be honest with you, given the fact that my mum doesn't read my papers, I don't think voters are either. And we don't need more policy to win the next election, right? The policy is absolutely great where it sits. We have to fill out the manifesto. But the thing we have to have concretely is the story that we're telling. Okay, and the story that we're telling has to have a narrative structure that convinces voters that we are on their side and the right people to vote for them. And so for our kind of story is something along the lines of, we have been made poorer for over a decade by this government in every area of our lives. And the reason why is we have an irresponsible Conservative government that has only ever cared about their mates, especially their super wealthy mates, has given them cash at every single available opportunity. We as the Labour Party will actually be the ones who are responsible, get these out and also invest in your future prosperity through our green prosperity plan to get wages up, deal with our long-term challenges and make us all more prosperous as a result. And the real key there is the dividing line between what the Conservatives have done wrong, i.e. they've been both incompetent, irresponsible and selfish. What we're going to do right, actually a competent, responsible long-term government in the interests of the British people. And that's what we've got to see. The next election, as every election we fought over the economy, over the economic argument, it's an economic argument we absolutely have to win. let's go with it. Thank you very much.